So thank you one more time for joining, that we can do this presentation together. So today we have this joint seminar, which is very exciting, to talk a little bit about the global open science hardware movement. I'm actually not even sure if that's the official correct name, because let me just share my screen. Because it's really originally Gathering for Open Science Hardware, but since it evolved into a movement, and sometimes we've called it this way, but then we'll hear from Bri what's currently most used. Okay, so we want to break down the movement a little bit, and this is going to be a presentation of 3 different people. And I will start a little bit with can I advance my slide? Here we go. With the beginning of the global open science hardware movement. And of course, I will present this a little bit from my experience and the initiatives I have been involved in and what we're doing now to further this movement. So it's not an official presentation basically from the organization, but since I've been involved from the very beginning, I can talk a little bit about how this came about. So at the moment, I'm running a lab here in Santiago, and we have a ton of different open source hardware pieces in the lab that we use for our research, and most of them are published in indexed journals, and that's a really great reality. Also, even in this field of biology laboratories, there are already a ton of different companies that specialize on open source hardware that's useful, and that's really, really exciting. These are all resources from a publication from last year in PLOS Biology from us. And this is a fantastic reality. But now we jump back basically 9 years ago, where this story starts and this movement starts. And all of this was just a dream at that time. And of course, there's the open source hardware definition that we should have again when we're talking about open source hardware and open science hardware. So open source hardware means that we publish hardware designs publicly so that anyone can study, modify, distribute, make, and sell the design. And the selling is an important difference to some open source software licenses and often talked about. And this definition was already there 9 years ago, actually, and it was brought up by the Open Source Hardware Association. But we're not talking about the Open Source Hardware Association. The Open Source Hardware Association, again, from my sort of personal point of view, I think it has become a little bit more international, but it was for a long time a very US-centered organization. But also, this is just about open source hardware. So there are a lot of, for example, professional electronics distributors there or developers. And it's not necessarily about scientific applications, which is why we're talking about open source, open science hardware, basically, which is the application of open source hardware for scientific endeavors, both in academia or without, or in art, or wherever science can be found. And so originally, this GOSH stands for Gathering for Open Science Hardware. And so we had to start the movement from somewhere. So this wasn't a known term. I mean, still, I think there are a lot of academics, unfortunately, who do not know what open source hardware is. But many people do know by now, I think. But at the time, this was really pretty unheard of. It was still early times even for open science movement in general, but the open access movement was already nicely on the way. And of course, open source software is already several decades ahead and well-known concept. So in 2015, the planning and application started for the first gathering for open science hardware in Geneva at CERN. And I didn't organize any of the GOSHs actually as one of the main organizers, but I did attend the first 3. So since I'm talking about the beginnings, I'm basically talking before the pandemic, basically. So there's been another GOSH in Panama that I'm not covering in my talk of the beginnings. But the first one was at CERN, and this was really to bring together people that care about open source hardware in science and start talking about the needs of the movement and starting. And so, yeah, actually, that brings me to the next one. So here, all the participants was really exciting. They have this red bus inside, so we had a lot of meetings in there as well. It was really fun. And this was to start the community. It's a very energizing movement. And thanks to the nice people that showed up and the good selection and this collaborative spirit of this sort of anti-conference workshop style meeting that didn't have just a lot of talks. There were very few talks, maybe 2 or so, but it was really about coming together and discussing what has to be done. And I think everybody was very energized and really started the movement. And so this was the beginning of the GOSH Forum, which is a great to-go-to place, a very active part of the conversation today. And it was started there basically. And also the GOSH Manifesto, which basically holds the values of the movement. And that's really something very special. So here, I don't have the whole manifesto now to walk through. I mean, you can see it online from the GOSH website, but here are the sort of main titles. And this is really about setting a different culture. So this is about democratizing science. And so I think that's why I'm as good to talk about this as almost anyone who was there in the beginning, because GOSH doesn't have high priests. So this is not very easy to pin down who is behind GOSH. So sorry, one step back. But it's really about the movement and anyone who is involved. So we're all pushing this forward together as a network without like very specific people who make it all possible, even though, of course, there were some people who, who really organized the first meetings and really drove the whole procedure. But so we defined this there in a lot of different discussions, and it's sort of very inclusive and accessible. And here you can, I just looked this up and I realized that I'm among the first 10 of the people who actually signed this manifesto. Now there are many hundreds of signatures. Okay, and for me, so this is not an official output of the first meeting, but I applied to come there and I was very involved already in open source hardware, mainly in the context of documentation best practices. So at the time I started this, or briefly before the meeting, I started this initiative DocuBricks that now is a little bit superseded by Git building that we're contributing to and supporting. But this is basically a tool to do high quality open source hardware documentations. So at the time, there were very few open source hardware examples, but it was already clear that documentation is a pressing issue. It still is, I think, nowadays. And so I was the main person, I guess, at the meeting who was always talking about what do we have to do to get to good documentations so that people can really use and believe in open source hardware for scientific practices. And so we talked a lot about this. And we also already got together a team for something I'll mention for the next meeting. So this was very important to bring together people who were invested in these issues, discussing also what does it mean, documentation to others, what's their perspective, what are the best practices, and what other things we need beyond documentation. And I'll get to that for the next meeting, because that brings us to next year. So it sounds like it was just a year later, but I think it was more than that. So it was maybe a year and a quarter, year and a half or something in between the different meetings, but it was already next year. There was the meeting in Santiago, actually at this very university where I'm a professor now. And I think at the time it was I had no idea that I would end up in this country or at this same university as a professor. But it was here at the Católica, and I was just visiting basically as a tourist and participating in that movement and that meeting. And that was very productive, again, in this unconference style, with people from all around the world. And we were talking and brainstorming, organizing to see how can we create a roadmap to make open science hardware ubiquitous around the world and commonplace. So what do we have to do? So the movement already is going, but what is the roadmap ahead to scale this, basically? And so this roadmap document is also publicly available on the website of GOSH. So I'm not going to walk through it in detail, but we created it at this meeting. Again, great energy. And so here I come to the next point. At the first meeting, we also gathered basically an initial team of people who were very keen on launching a journal of open hardware. And so in this year and a half or so, we prepared everything, found a publishing partner, wrote all the guidelines and everything, and we really opened this for submissions at the second GOSH. So really, it's also a initiative from within GOSH and the GOSH community, even though it's not sort of officially and exclusively linked to GOSH as an organization. Anyways, at that time, there was no organization. So we just had some meetings and there was the community. And so I'd already mentioned that I was talking a lot about documentation. And so the question was, how can we enforce documentation? And also, so if you want to comply with the open source hardware license or with the open source hardware definition, sorry, it's not very hard. So you basically need to make your design files public and you need to put an open source hardware appropriate license. And then it's open source. However, this doesn't mean that any scientist, for example, can replicate it. So especially for scientific context, you really need something like quality control data. What about safety in a lab usage, calibration? How do you calibrate this device that you're building, and so on? So this is difficult to make sure that this information is there for scientific use. And so in a journal, we have this possibility as including this into our templates and enforcing it through reviewers. And mostly we see this journal as a community initiative where people from the open source hardware community advise authors on their submissions, how can they improve sort of the openness and accessibility of their hardware before it gets publicly published. So I think this has been great because at the time, it was really difficult to publish these kind of things. So we've come a long way. And at the time, for example, the open flexure microscope, which is often now used as a sort of poster child of a successful open source hardware initiative that's been replicated around the world, that it was very difficult to publish initially. So now it's a very sexy thing to publish in all kinds of specialized journals and open hardware journals. There are hundreds of publications, if not thousands. But at the time, it was difficult and it wasn't very accepted. And so I think we made an important contribution by launching this journal and also setting some kind of best practices in the field and opening it up. Okay, so this was the second meeting. And then we come to the third, which was again sort of a year and a half later. So this was like November, I think, or so of 2018. In Shenzhen, a very exciting place, again, another part of the world, very inclusive. I have to mention, sorry, I didn't remove this. The roadmap was already from last time. So this was about really scaling the community, building the community. So now we had a manifesto that defines the spirit and the codex of how we want to get together. We have this roadmap, how to address, policy issues, scaling issues, and so on. And now it's sort of about building the global communities and regional networks, for example. It was very interesting to discuss. And also the meeting reflected that because there were a lot of new people there. So I felt that I was actually one of few people who also attended the other two GOSHs. And there were a lot of discussions already that were pretty much similar or the same from the other years. So I already found myself a lot in this role of joining these different discussion groups and say, okay, but please don't forget, we've already discussed these things in depth with this community and the resources are publicly available here from the other GOSH meeting and so on. But I guess it's important that there's always a mix of old and new. So that was the focus there. There was also a lot of people who brought hardware pieces there. And what I should mention is that thanks to the organizers, and Jenny and Shannon should be definitely mentioned in this context, they've really put a huge effort into making this very accessible and making these first meetings a big success. They've managed to acquire quite a lot of funding from foundations, the Sloan foundations, I think. I hope I don't miss anyone now. They're important fundings. So these meetings were quite expensive because people who are advocates for open source hardware in GOSH, in science, they're not necessarily, well, they're all over the world and they don't necessarily have a lot of resources, for example, to travel and attend these meetings. So they were quite expensive because we really wanted to bring a diverse crowd from all around the world together to this meeting. So a lot of money went into financing the travel, and a lot of energy went into the visa processes, especially for the very active African open source hardware community. That's unfortunately always a big issue to process all the visas in time. And the organizers had to support quite a lot to make this happen. And I think they did a fantastic job. And it was a very diverse crowd. And thanks to that, really, GOSH is such a global movement now. Okay, so those were the 3 meetings. And for me, one of the highlights really of meeting in Shenzhen was the electronics market in Shenzhen, which is really a unique place in the world. So here you see a map. So it's a giant city. I don't remember how many million are there, but it's another kind of scale that's not known from Europe or America. This city is really huge. But this yellow area, so these many, many buildings, including various skyscrapers, all of this is one absolutely gigantic electronics market. And so in these big towers, they're just floors and floors of little stands, basically. I mean, some are bigger shops, some are little stands, and you can buy absolutely anything electronic and hardware related you can imagine. We also visited some incubators there, and it was super interesting to see, to reflect upon the sort of Chinese way of approaching open source and the possibilities locally of building almost anything within a day. And it's really incredible. Okay. And this brings me back to the present time. So this was the beginning. So we had these meetings and we really formed this community with these important policy documents. But the overall mission was to make open science hardware ubiquitous, so present everywhere, basically in academia or in science, so not just academia, by 2025. And now we have already 2024, so this is very soon, actually, it's sort of next year. But you have to see that this little history covered sort of 9 years, so it's a long time, and it's really a community. So at the time it wasn't an organization. Now we have it, and Bri will talk about that. But so it's really about what everybody in this community does to make this dream come true. And so I'll talk a little bit more, wrapping up here, about what we're doing, especially in the present, to make this dream come true. And I hope that I already mentioned several initiatives that have been very important. So first of all, now I'm running my own lab since 3.5 years, starting in the pandemic. So maybe it's a little bit less than 3.5 years on reality. And on GitHub, on our GitHub repository, we have a ton of open source hardware equipment that we're developing or have finished developing. So that's part of the reality, what we're doing at the moment. And we develop high throughput bioanalysis hardware as open source hardware to share the sort of cutting edge research applications with everybody. So to implement it, first of all, here in Chile, because that would be logistically and financially prohibitive to really do this in the normal way, maybe, but also that other people can join in. And so we've also been involved in a number of interesting initiatives around GOSH that have been driven by GOSH members or other people, but it's related to this movement. So there's, for example, the Open Know-how standard, which is sort of a metadata format for open source hardware documentation, so they become more findable on the internet and more machine processable. There is the DIN specification. So DIN is basically the German Institute for Standards. And this is very exciting because this is the first ever open access standard. So normally you have to pay money to read a standard. And this is also not a full standard, but it's a specification at least, defining open source hardware mainly for the industry context. So to make it clearer, for example, it's a little bit this idea of open washing that we're trying to counter there. So if it's not well defined, people can just claim that what they're doing is open source hardware, but maybe because now it's a sexy term, they just claim that, but they're not really doing it. So here it's sort of defined what this means. And then, of course, I haven't contributed to this, but there is the Open Source Hardware Association certification also that's been quite popular, where you can sort of submit your open source hardware design documentation, and then they certify that this is really open hardware. We also, for example, wrote a review or like an advice document, an opinion piece, however you want to call it, on promoting using sort of maker electronics and so on in science, and Raspberry Pi and microcontrollers and so on, and where to start and which are suitable boards for what, for example. And now from a more Latin American perspective, so this is of course now my aim mainly to drive this movement in the region of Latin America. And so here's a piece from me that's been sort of well read and cited already, where we're talking about how do we manage this global transformation to have a different way of accessing laboratory equipment, and in particular in a global context. So how does this have to be designed and shared so that it really works for all regions of the world, and not just in the place like in US and Europe, basically, where most scientific equipment is being built. These are just some highlights and things that I've been involved in for the movement. And then, of course, now we're running already the third year of the Latin American Hub for Bioimaging through Open Hardware. This is a Sean Zuckerberg financed initiative, where it's based here in our institute, basically at the Institute for Biological and Medical Engineering in Santiago, at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. And we are really trying to promote the idea of building your own equipment and sharing know-how in Latin America. So this is together with my colleagues. I'm leading this initiative, but it's together with my colleagues who are also here in the call. Pablo Cremades, who's mainly working on open source MRI, magnetoresonance imaging, and Vicente Parrot, who's a microscope building expert and also working on computational microscopy in this team. So we are running a lot of workshops. So there's another workshop actually in 2 weeks and another one at the end of the year. So if you're interested to participate, please check out our website. To bring people together really and have hands-on training. So the first one that we did was on the robotic microscopes of the open flexure, but the other ones are on sort of lasers, illumination sources for microscopy, image analysis, strobe illumination, many kind of topics, mainly centered around bioimaging. And we share all of these resources on our YouTube channel. So there we have a lot of seminars like this one that will be shared there, but also tutorials on how to build things or do things around the lab as makers. And of course, we share all the sort of CAD designs where you use mainly digital fabrication to be able to share quickly around the world our designs, and we share them online. We use Onshape for our designs, and we also use printables and Thingiverse to share our printable designs. And then we have detailed documentations with an open source hardware license, and the detailed documentations are still key, especially in a biology lab context, for people to be able to really reconstruct these things without needing a lot of know-how. So if you, for example, share the design of an electronics board with another electronics engineer, it might be fine to just share the main design files without any comments, and they might be able to understand it. But in a science context, people don't normally have that level of expertise. So you need a lot of detailed documentation from people to really reconstruct the device and modify it. Okay, of course, we also have a GitHub from the LIBRE Hub project. So some of our hardware designs are also there, and other events and resources from the initiative. We've already run a number of trainings. And of course, we also have some teaching courses here at the university where we teach open source hardware and sort of lab automation. And of course, very important, that's always what I recommend, build on other people's open source hardware designs and use them and contribute there. For example, here for bioimaging with these robotic microscopes as a class set, and Napari software, which is open source Python software. Okay, now I've talked quite long already. I hope that I've been able to convey a little bit where were we at 9 years ago, this amazing community that's also brought me to be an open source hardware advocate, and connecting with people around the world to make this happen, and the different initiatives we started, thanks to the possibility of coming together and talking to the right people about what needs to be done and how can we scale this movement. And so now I would like to hand over to Brianna, or Bri, to talk a little bit about the process of having an organization behind GOSH, which means that there's also a bit more structural finance and organization and sustainability to this movement and what's currently going on. And then Pablo volunteered to tell us a little bit about the movement in Latin America. I've only mentioned some initiatives that we are very strongly involved in, and this is something I care about, but I've obviously came to Latin America only recently, and Pablo can tell us about all the amazing things that have gone on here in this community for longer.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bree, and I am the community coordinator for the Gathering for Open Science Hardware, usually just known as the GOSH community, this international group that is advocating for open science hardware on a global scale. Just for context for this presentation, I don't necessarily have much of a technical background, but much rather my background is in community organizing, and I've been involved in various citizen science and community science movements before I got involved with the GOSH community. And I'm very excited to present alongside Pablo and Tobias today because, as Tobias said, he's kind of been around in GOSH since the early days. I started actually in GOSH in 2021, so my kind of perspective comes a little bit more from those years and onwards. But I think kind of having that historical knowledge shared by Tobias has been really helpful for today's presentation. Yes, and then I also have a resource guide as well that I don't know if I'm able to share it in the chat right now, but I'll make sure that you all can get it afterwards. So basically, if there's anything that you find particularly interesting that I talk about today, it's likely in that resource guide, and you don't have to stress out about like taking pictures of slides and things like that.
We can link that into the YouTube description of the video.
Absolutely. Cool. So I kind of want to touch on something that Tobias brought up early on in his presentation of global open science hardware, gathering for open science hardware. What do these terms mean and where do they come from? And I just want to start off by acknowledging that both of these terms exist, and it's perfectly okay for us to work in a space in which they both exist. So the acronym for GOSH, sometimes you might hear gathering for open science hardware, and sometimes you might hear global open science hardware. For me in particular, I view gathering as a specific reference to that particular convening place, whether that's in person or virtually, that members of this global open science hardware community may participate in. So for me, I kind of see the gathering of open science hardware, this GOSH community, existing within this broader global open science hardware movement. And so just for context, that for most of this presentation, that when I say GOSH, I'm probably just referring to the Gathering for Open Science Hardware community. On this note as well, I've also found that in GOSH, we have had some interesting discussions around translations. And oftentimes you can't directly translate Gathering for Open Science Hardware into other languages, which has led to other terms like Global Open Science Hardware emerging, and also has kind of given us this sort of validation that it is okay for both of these terms to exist and that the G can be fluid in representing both of these things. So if I am referring to GOSH as this gathering, what I'm really talking about is this particular community that has emerged to fill the purpose of being a convening place. And this is a convening place for practitioners of open science hardware. And we have shared values that have been established by our manifesto. We have a shared goal of making open science hardware ubiquitous as outlined by our roadmap. And so it's very interesting how the Gathering for Open Science Hardware kind of emerges as that network or convening space. And I know Tobias just talked about this, but I'm happy to bring it up again. Again, open source hardware, as defined by the Open Source Hardware Association, is related to design files that are made so anyone can study, modify, distribute, make, or sell them. And again, similar to what he was saying, open science hardware, it takes this definition of open source hardware, but it applies it to the tools and machinery that we are using for scientific research. And I just quickly do want to acknowledge that hardware is quite complex compared to other scientific outputs like software or data. Like with software, we're just worried about using code. With open access publications, it's just a publication we're worried about making open access. But with hardware, we're working with a multitude of things like components that might be sourced from different places, like the design files and even the code that might run on it. And I think this is interesting as we kind of have this emerging paradigm of moving towards open science practices that may often exclude hardware from that. Just to make sure that we are including hardware in these open science initiatives and kind of having an understanding of how we can standardize a lot of things around open science hardware so that it can be better included. And then I did want to share just a quick video from our recent gathering that took place in Panama in 2022. But in order to do this, I'm going to have to stop sharing this particular screen and then move on to YouTube. So, all right, it should be full screen. You can see this, correct?
Open science hardware is about clear boxes. It's about being able to see everything inside of your tool, know exactly how it works, and know how it can be replicated for anyone in the world. This year, we brought the Gathering for Open Science Hardware to Panama. I'm really excited about having us in Panama because there's almost no place on Earth where you can have this very fascinating intersection, especially for a group that's as interested in science and technology as us, to have both of those right there. This massive globalization right next to a bunch of howler monkeys making sounds in the jungle. Probably the most important thing about the GOSH community is making these connections between all of these wonderfully strange individuals who are all incredibly active and excited about sharing their thing and finding outlets and communities for them to share with.
That was a little bit more seamless than I thought it was going to be, so I will take that.
That worked pretty well.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised by that. Oh, I think it is playing sound though now. Hold on. Yeah, okay. It should say the gatherings where it all started now. Cool. So I know Tobias talked a little bit about kind of the gatherings early on, and I will touch on them here as well, but kind of explain a little bit more context of what happened after 2018 as well. So as mentioned before, and also another one of the reasons why I like to share that video is because I think it does a good job demonstrating what some people might call the ad hocracy nature of the GOSH community. It's very much a community of people who will start their own projects and take initiative on their own pieces of hardware or projects that they want to work on. And GOSH kind of comes in to fill this role of just being a network point, a connection point. And I think that video really shows that you have not only a diversity of people from different regions and disciplines, but people that are willing to just bring a whole wide array of projects into one space. And yeah, the importance of making sure that we are intentional about creating networks that can just hold these projects and these people up. Yeah, so basically the gatherings are typically in an unconference style event, and this is where the agenda is set collectively as a group, usually during the first day of meeting. Again, this first gathering was in 2016 in CERN, and it led to the GOSH Manifesto. And I just quickly wanted to touch on something that I think is important about the manifesto is sometimes I may be asked as a community organizer, what do you think is important when you want to build a community? I almost always reference the GOSH Manifesto because even though I was not in GOSH when this document was created, as someone who joined in 2021, this document has been absolutely fantastic because it sets the tone for the community. And I can know what is in line with GOSH's values because the community has said so. And so anyone that is interested in kind of building a community, I definitely say write down your shared values and your purpose, and it will be like a guiding star that can help you as you continue to grow. And yeah, so as Tobias said, the next meeting was in Chile in 2017, and then they went to Shenzhen in 2018. From 2019 to 2021, there were no physical gatherings, of course, due to the global COVID-19 pandemic. But the community was still very much active, and this was on our community forum. And so while a lot of GOSH is based on our in-person gatherings, I think it's important to note the importance of our community forum and how we were able to maintain kind of consistency by interacting with each other through the forum. And also I would do calls very similar to this seminar. I would do community calls and open hours and just different kind of online events so that people can kind of maintain engagement as a community. In 2022, we were fortunate enough to meet again in Panama City and Panama. And similar to 2018, we did have a little bit of that sort of tension, I guess I will say, of when you have older people returning that are ready to kind of move on to new topics on the agenda versus new people who this might be their first time learning about open science hardware. That was still kind of a little bit of a tension point of trying to navigate how to run an event when you have two kind of separate audiences in that way. But I think the overarching kind of sentiment was a feeling of sort of care and relaxation of all being able to be back together after going about 4 years without seeing each other. And so I think that's a testament to how keeping an engaged community, even online, is important, because then when you meet again in person, it's relieving, really. So yeah. Of course, the roadmap is a fantastic resource from the GOSH community. I mean, it guides all the actions that we want to take, like creating institutional and funding support structures, broadening the community, creating mentorship programs, all of that stuff. I don't have enough time, so I won't dive too deep into this. I also want to quickly mention that we do have a lot of publications and policy briefs. Part of our roadmap was to create documents such as this to reach like key audiences and stakeholders that we think can help bolster open science hardware and make it ubiquitous. We have policy briefs that have been aimed at research funders, technology transfer offices, and also international policymakers. And so I definitely, if you are interested in the policy side of open science hardware, we have that stuff on our website and it's really useful. We've also documented our framework on how to run a GOSH event. So if anyone wants to run a sort of unconference style event related to open hardware, it's like a 100-page document and it's really, really useful. And it's kind of a good way of sharing that institutional knowledge so that it isn't lost. Also, I do want to mention we have tons of other resources. I just don't have time to get into them. We have got animated videos explaining open science hardware to a general audience. We have documentation of different funding programs we've had. We've funded regional events across the globe, like collaborative development programs for making hardware, all sorts of stuff. But I only have a few minutes left in this presentation, and these will all be linked to in the resource guide that I will send to you all later. And so a very, very important part of the GOSH community and the roadmap is growth, but ensuring that the community can grow in a local and regional way. And so the global open science hardware movement has been very decentralized, and we've seen a lot of self-organized communities emerge because of this. And for example, one is Africa OSH in Africa, and then reGOSH in Latin America, which Pablo will be telling us a bit more about later. I also want to mention that in terms of growing the GOSH network, we're going to have our first ever cohort of GOSH ambassadors this year. I'm very excited to be announcing this in August. This is the first time we've done this, and we think it's going to be a fantastic way of connecting GOSH with new and existing communities and kind of building those bridges between the GOSH network and other adjacent communities. And we've got a whole handbook that we're publishing that's meant not only for ambassadors, but anyone who wants to advocate for open science hardware. And so I'm really excited to publish this in English, French, and Spanish in the coming weeks. All right, this is my last slide, and I'll make sure we have enough time for Pablo. I just wanted to close my presentation today on a really important quote that I think does a great job of describing GOSH. And kind of understanding that open science hardware, like the tools themselves, are in fact embedded in social realities, and that the act of making together is as crucial as hardware itself. And so I just want to quote Julieta Rancio and Shannon Dosmegan, who are two very important GOSH community members who do a lot of work in policy. And they say that by allowing multiple perspectives and needs to materialize in research equipment, open hardware can become a powerful tool for transforming power dynamics and knowledge production, offering a glimpse of what more efficient and more inclusive research could look like in the future. Yeah, so I just wanted to touch on that last point. If you have any questions, I will share a resource guide and these slides back with you all. And thank you for listening.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Bri. I'm also looking forward to receiving some questions at the end of the call, but I would suggest also that we move on to Pablo's presentation and then open the floor for any questions. That was really insightful.
Okay, thank you very much, Tobias and Bri, for already introducing what reGOSH is a little bit. I'm Pablo Cremades, and I'm adjunct professor at Facultad de Ciencias Exactas y Naturales at Universidad Nacional de Cuyo in Mendoza, and also the regional coordinator of the Mendoza node of reGOSH. I'm just switching to my presentation. Okay, so everything started in Valparaiso in 2018 at TecnoX. TecnoX was like a competition for open hardware technology, and Fernan Federici invited a few of us attending the event to write a project to create like a Latin American network of people working on open source hardware. So what is reGOSH? reGOSH is a network that connects people and communities and institutions working on free and open source technology for science and education in Latin America. We felt the need to connect these people that were already spread across Latin America, trying to solve the same kind of problems and struggle with the same difficulties. So soon reGOSH became what we call the Latin American chapter of GOSH, because we are aligned with the principles and the manifesto of GOSH that Bri kindly introduced. And the network started with nodes in many countries around Latin America, like Mexico, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Brazil, Uruguay, Chile, and Argentina. The mission of reGOSH is to raise awareness of challenges and opportunities related to the use of free and open source technologies in science and education in different parts of Latin America, and to develop and adapt technologies to assess specific needs in different contexts in our region. Because one of the problems we face is that sometimes we knew about an open source development around the world that could help us to assess some specific problem, but we couldn't afford or we couldn't have access to the technology. As we stated, the hardware is a little bit more difficult than software, because you need to access the electronic components, for instance, or some specific manufacturing technology that might not be available in Latin America. So how do we achieve this? So we decided to organize a series of residencies, working residencies, that would bring together people to work on projects that were high priority for the network. The event consisted on workshops, seminars, and conferences, and they would last from 2 to 3 weeks. And these residencies were initially funded by CITED, el Programa Iberoamericano de Ciencia y Tecnología para el Desarrollo. The first residency took place in Porto Alegre in Brazil in 2019, and it brought together 26 participants from 6 different countries, and we worked on 7 different projects, from air quality monitoring, water monitoring, CNC machines, and many, many more. Due to the COVID pandemic, the following residency wouldn't take place until 2022. This residency and regional GOSH gathering event was held in Mendoza with support from GOSH and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. And this time we work on the development of tools for agroecology and environmental health. The residency brought together more than 50 participants and 5 community and local organizations to work on these projects. And I left you a link to a brief video describing what happened at this residency. I won't show the video right now because it's in Spanish and it might be a little bit long. One of the outcome of the Mendoza, where we document all the projects we are working on this community. This GitLab instance is running in a server at our university, so that we overcome all the limitation of the global instance of GitLab, like the number of members that each project can have. Finally, in 2023, the residency was held in Valle Exploradores, Región de Aysén, Chile, and the participants work on the development of open access tools for molecular pathogens diagnostic, environmental sample processing, and methods for sharing field kinetic data. The reGOSH network also organized many other shorter events, like reGOSHito in Buenos Aires in 2023, that seek to keep people connected and to advance the projects that we started working on previous residencies. We also organize some workshops and seminars, like, for instance, a workshop to build open source community sensors. The Federici Lab visited Mendoza in 2 opportunities to bring technology to work on molecular biology. We held some workshops on CNC machines and CAD tools like Blender and so on. So what about our current projects? We're here in Mendoza, for instance, we are working on 2 main projects. One is from LITEC, el Laboratorio Interdisciplinario de Tecnologías para la Enseñanza de Ciencias. We work on the development of open source hardware for teaching science, mainly physics, because I became a physics teacher a couple of years ago. And the other one is the Open Agroecology Lab that works on the development of technologies to help rural organizations and researchers and activists that seeks to be part and support the agroecological transition in Argentina, by facilitating the collective building of knowledge and public amplification of agroecology. And Nano is leading that project here in Mendoza. Other very significant project for the network is Pipetine, a project by Nicolás Mendes, which is about an open source robot for Pipetine. And this project received a grant by GOSH. Our friends from Chile work, among other things, in the development of open educational resources for distributed hands-on teaching in molecular biology, and in collaboration with other organizations. Sorry, let me go back. They also work in the development of open reagents for molecular biology and open protocols. Other groups from the network are working in citizen-led water and air quality monitoring with community members like Preservamos or Cosensores. There you have the link to contact those organizations. They propose to combine practices and scientific knowledge of the academic sphere with knowledge from other communities in the region. Finally, there's a collaboration in progress with IO Rodeo and Open Science Shop Initiative to adapt some of the open source hardware that the global community has developed over the years to make them easily reproducible here in Latin America and to be commercialized locally. This is just a brief list of the many projects reGOSH is working on. And to finish, I just want to thank the people that contributed to this presentation, like Fernand, Nano, Nico, Kevin, and Ale.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Pablo, for telling us about all the amazing stuff that's been going on in the Latin America community. I mean, I think that the Latin America community and the African community, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think are the most active sort of regional communities that we have in GOSH at the moment. That's very exciting. maybe we should wrap it up. I think it was a really good resource, and I mean that's the wonderful thing about GOSH. Really, I think it's an incredibly inclusive community. You know, we all have the same goals, and there is this wonderful forum where we actually can discuss anything. And I mean, sometimes it happens to me that discussions become so lively that I can't read all the messages, and then I don't know anymore which direction is the conversation going in. But I think that's a good thing, you know, of an inclusive process. So we can follow up on anything there. We'll include the resources, especially from Bri, in the description of the video, so it's easy to find. And okay, I don't see another questions, so I'll just thank you again for organizing this with me, for sharing the wonder of GOSH with a wider community to keep growing the community. And I'm excited to see you at the next possibilities, online or in person.
Thank you so much for organizing. Good to see you all. Hope to see you again.
Thank you very much. Nice to see you as well.